This is a true story that was shared on a forum dedicated to discussing werewolves in 2007. The Johnson family had been discussing the possibility of a fresh start for months. John, a 40-year-old engineer, had grown increasingly tired of the hustle and bustle of city life. His job was demanding, the city was loud and crowded, and he couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. Emma, his wife, had always dreamed of a quieter, simpler life. She longed for a place where they could escape the constant noise and fast pace, a place where the boys, Luke, their 11-year-old, and Eli, their 10-year-old, could grow up with room to play and explore. One evening, as Emma sat at the kitchen table looking over listings online, she turned to John with an excited look on her face. "Look at this, John," she said, her eyes scanning the screen. "It's a house, out in the country. It's perfect for us. A yard, space to breathe, a fresh start." John rubbed his forehead, unsure. "It seems like a good deal, but something feels off. It's too cheap." Emma smiled, as if trying to reassure him. "Maybe it's just meant to be. We've been talking about this for so long, and this place could really be what we need." John sighed and took a long look at the listing. The price seemed impossibly low for a house of that size, enough space for the boys to play, a big backyard, and located in a small town in another state. "You're right," he finally said. "It's a chance we should take. We need a change." A few days later, they packed their belongings. Rex, their loyal German shepherd, hopped into the back of the van, and the family started the long drive to their new home. John and Emma weren't sure exactly what they were expecting, but they were both ready for something different. They said their goodbyes to the life they had known, determined to embrace whatever this new chapter would bring. As they drove along the highway, Luke and Eli chattered excitedly in the back seat. The road stretched on ahead of them, wide and empty. The landscape gradually shifted from city streets to open fields and forests, making the journey feel like a transition to an entirely different world. "I can't wait to see the new house," Luke said, his voice full of excitement. "I bet it's huge," Eli added, bouncing in his seat. John glanced in the rearview mirror at his two sons, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the right move after all. The drive was long, but the promise of a new life kept their spirits high. By the time they arrived at the small town, the sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow across the streets. The town was quieter than they had expected, no busy downtown or crowded intersections. Just a few local shops and a couple of old-fashioned diners. It felt like a place frozen in time, where nothing ever really changed. They decided to stop at a local cafe before heading to their new house. It was a small, cozy place, with wooden floors and a few old men sitting at the counter sipping coffee. The air was thick with the smell of fried food and the murmur of low conversation. As they entered, a bell above the door rang, and a couple of heads turned toward them. One of the men at the counter, a grizzled old biker with a long beard and worn leather jacket, stared at them as they made their way to a table. "Well, well," he said in a gravelly voice. "Look at the newcomers." John tried to smile, hoping to ease the tension. "Yep, just moved in. We're looking forward to a fresh start." The biker took a slow sip from his mug, his eyes narrowing. "You folks buy that old Thompson place?" "That's right," Emma replied, giving him a polite smile. It seemed like a good deal. The price was way lower than we expected. The biker let out a raspy laugh, his lips curling into a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, let me tell you something. That house, it's probably the worst deal you'll ever make." John raised an eyebrow, sensing a warning in the man's tone. "What do you mean?" The biker leaned back in his seat, his chair creaking under his weight. "You'll see for yourselves. People around here don't talk about that place much, but I'll tell you, it's cursed. Something bad happened there a long time ago." Emma opened her mouth to ask more, but the biker stood up before she could speak. "But hey, what do I know?" he said with a shrug. "Just an old man with a lot of time on his hands." The man left the cafe without another word, leaving the family in silence. They exchanged uneasy glances. The atmosphere in the small cafe had shifted. What had started as a friendly stop for food now felt a little more foreboding. "Well, that was strange," John muttered, trying to brush it off. "Probably just some local guy who's seen too many horror movies." "I don't know," Emma replied quietly. Something about the way he said it. The family finished their meal in silence, their minds still on the biker's warning. But they knew one thing for sure. They couldn't turn back now. The house was theirs, and they would have to face whatever came next. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time the Johnson family pulled into the small town. The streets were quieter than they'd expected. No bustling crowds or busy intersections, just a few sleepy houses and the occasional car passing by. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed to know everyone, and nothing happened too fast. John took a deep breath as he parked the van on the side of the road. "Well, we're here," he said, glancing at Emma. His voice was tired, but there was a sense of anticipation behind it too. They'd spent the last few hours in the car, the quiet driving giving them time to think about the new life that awaited them. "This is it," Emma replied, her voice filled with a soft optimism. "The beginning of our new chapter." Luke and Eli were buzzing with excitement in the back seat, talking over each other as they stared out of the window, wide-eyed. "Look at that old diner," Luke exclaimed. "It's like something out of a movie." Eli, who always had his nose in a book, pointed to a nearby park. "I bet there's a good spot for hide and seek there." John smiled at their enthusiasm. "All right, let's grab a bite to eat, and then we'll head to the house." They made their way to the cafe the biker had pointed out earlier. The bell above the door jingled as they stepped inside, and the familiar scent of coffee and grease wafted over them. The place was exactly as John had imagined, a cozy, old-school diner with mismatched tables and a low murmur of conversation. There were a couple of older men at the counter, and the waitress, a middle-aged woman with a friendly smile, waved them to a corner booth. They sat down, the boys immediately starting to talk about their plans for the new house. "I'm going to make a treehouse in the backyard," Luke declared, his eyes lighting up with excitement. "Yeah, and I'll have my own room," Eli said. "A room that's all mine." John and Emma exchanged a smile, both feeling the same excitement, but also a tinge of uncertainty. Everything was happening so fast, and they couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this move than they fully understood. While the boys were busy planning their new life, the door to the cafe opened, and the old biker from earlier stepped in. His leather jacket creaked as he walked in, and the room seemed to quiet down just a little. He scanned the room, and his eyes immediately landed on the Johnson family sitting at their booth. John tried to ignore him, but the biker's eyes seemed to follow them as he moved toward the counter. He was muttering something under his breath, but John couldn't make out the words. "Everything all right?" Emma asked, noticing the shift in John's expression. "Yeah," he replied, though his voice sounded unsure. "Just feels like something's off." Before Emma could ask more, the biker turned and looked straight at them. He didn't say anything at first, just stared. Then, with a crooked grin, he finally spoke. Well, looks like you folks made it," he said, his voice raspy. "Bought the Thompson place, huh?" John and Emma exchanged a glance, then nodded. "That's right," John said, trying to keep the conversation light. "We're looking forward to settling in." The biker didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a long drag from his cigarette, the embers glowing in the dim light. Then he slowly turned toward them again, his eyes dark and serious. "You sure you want to move in there?" he asked, his voice lowering. "That place, it's got a reputation. People around here don't talk about it much, but I'll tell you this, it's the worst deal you'll ever make." And John's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" The biker's gaze never wavered, and the smile on his face faded into something darker. "There's a reason it's so cheap. Trust me, it's not a place you want to mess with. Some things happen there, things that can't be explained. I'd think twice if I were you." Emma leaned in, trying to get a better sense of what the man was talking about. "What happened?" The biker simply shook his head. "Like I said, people around here don't talk about it. But you'll find out soon enough. That place is cursed. I'd get out while I still could." With that, he stood up, dropped a few crumpled bills on the counter, and walked out without another word. The bell above the door jingled again, and the cafe returned to its quiet hum. John and Emma sat there for a long moment, exchanging glances as the silence stretched between them. The boys didn't notice, too busy with their plans for the house, but the tension in the air was palpable. John cleared his throat. "I don't know what that was about. he muttered, but I'm not going to let some old guy's warning ruin this. Emma nodded, though her eyes seemed distant. It was just a warning, I guess, but something about it felt off. Despite their growing unease, they finished their meal and got back into the van. The town seemed even quieter now, the streets empty as they drove toward their new home. They were still hopeful, but there was a creeping feeling settling in the pit of their stomachs, like they were walking into something they didn't fully understand. As they pulled up to the house, the sun had almost completely set. The house looked much like the listing photos, old but charming, with a large front yard and a few trees scattered around the property. It seemed peaceful enough, though a strange chill hung in the air. "Well," John said, trying to shake off the unease, "we're here. Let's see what this place is really like." The family stepped out of the van, Rex bounding out of the back and running toward the front door. They followed him up the driveway, unaware of the unsettling days ahead. The Johnson family spent the next few days unloading boxes and settling into their new home. The house, though older, had a certain charm to it. The large front porch was perfect for sitting out on cool evenings, and the backyard stretched out with plenty of room for Luke and Eli to run around. It was a peaceful place, a far cry from the crowded city they had left behind. "I can't believe this is ours," Emma said, standing in the living room, surveying their new space. It was a little musty, but it had the kind of coziness that made her feel at ease. The wallpaper was dated, and the hardwood floors creaked underfoot, but Emma didn't mind. This was the change they had dreamed of. Luke and Eli had already claimed their rooms upstairs, each one deciding where to set up their belongings. Rex had found his new favorite spot by the front door, looking out the large window as if guarding the house. As the days passed, they explored the surrounding area. The town was smaller than they had expected, with only a few local stores, a post office, and a small park. It had a quiet, almost sleepy vibe. It felt like time moved slower here, which both comforted and unsettled them. One afternoon, while John and Emma unpacked the last of the boxes in the kitchen, Luke and Eli decided to take Rex for a walk through the woods behind the house. The woods seemed peaceful at first, the trees thick and green, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze. "I can't believe how quiet it is here," Eli said, his voice barely a whisper as he walked along the dirt path. "I know," Luke replied. "It's like we're in another world." Rex trotted ahead, sniffing the ground, his ears perked up. The boys followed him, taking in their new surroundings. They had only been walking for a few minutes when something caught Luke's eye. "Did you see that?" Luke whispered, pointing to the edge of the trees. Eli squinted. "What is it?" There, barely visible among the trees, was a figure, a tall shape, standing perfectly still. It was too far to make out any details, but the figure seemed off. It wasn't a person, not exactly, but it didn't look like an animal either. "Let's go check it out," Luke suggested, excitement in his voice. "No way," Eli protested. "It's probably nothing." But Luke, always the more adventurous one, was already moving forward, Rex bounding ahead of him. "Come on, it's probably just a deer or something." Eli hesitated for a moment, then followed his brother, though his steps were slower, more cautious. As they neared the spot where the figure had been, they saw nothing. The woods were still and silent, as if whatever had been there had vanished. "This is creepy," Eli muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Luke frowned. "Yeah, maybe, but it's probably just our eyes playing tricks on us." Rex barked suddenly, his ears alert. He was standing at the base of a tree, staring intently at something in the distance. The boys looked over in the same direction, but they couldn't see anything clearly. The figure had disappeared. "Let's go back," Eli said, clearly uncomfortable. Luke nodded. "Yeah, I don't like this. Let's head home." As they made their way back to the house, the unease lingered in the air. Rex trotted along behind them, still looking over his shoulder every few seconds, his fur bristling as if he sensed something they didn't. When they returned to the house, John and Emma were busy in the kitchen, unaware of the strange encounter in the woods. The boys didn't mention it to them, but both Luke and Eli couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the woods. The strange figure, the way Rex had acted, it all felt too real to ignore. The next few days passed without incident, but something was different. The atmosphere in the house seemed heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding on to secrets. Rex grew more agitated, barking at nothing and pacing the front yard at odd hours. The boys kept to themselves more than usual, preferring to stay inside rather than venture out into the woods. It was on the fifth night, as the family was getting ready for bed, that things began to take a darker turn. The first night in the house had been uneventful, but by the fifth night, the atmosphere had shifted. The house, once cozy and welcoming, now felt strangely oppressive. The air seemed to hang heavy, and the creaking of the old house in the night felt different, darker. John and Emma had just finished putting the boys to bed. Luke and Eli had settled into their new rooms upstairs, though neither of them seemed to sleep well. Rex, their German shepherd, had been pacing restlessly in the living room, his nails clicking against the wooden floors. Emma had noticed his behavior, but hadn't thought much of it. After all, Rex had always been an anxious dog, especially in unfamiliar places. But tonight was different. Emma sat in the living room, reading a book while John watched TV. The house was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Rex was lying in front of the door, but every now and then he would sit up abruptly, ears perked, and stare at the hallway that led to the stairs. "Rex, what's wrong?" Emma muttered, scratching his head. He didn't respond, but his gaze never left the darkened hall. His fur bristled, and he let out a low growl, the sound vibrating in the stillness of the room. John glanced at Emma, his eyebrows furrowed. "What's he doing?" "I don't know," she said, worry creeping into her voice. "He's been acting strange all evening." Before John could respond, a sound broke through the silence, something outside. A rustling, a movement just beyond the trees. Rex jumped to his feet, barking loudly, his tail stiff with tension. Emma's heart skipped a beat. "What was that?" "I'll check," John said, standing up and walking toward the door. He grabbed a flashlight from the table and opened the door cautiously, peering out into the yard. The wind rustled the leaves in the trees, but nothing seemed out of place. The yard was bathed in moonlight, the shadows stretching long and thin. John stepped outside, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the property. "Nothing here," he called back over his shoulder. "Just the wind." Rex, still tense, refused to settle down. He paced back and forth, his nails clicking sharply against the floor again. John closed the door and locked it, though the unsettling feeling lingered. "Maybe we're just not used to the quiet," he suggested, trying to shake off the tension in his chest. Emma nodded, though she didn't seem convinced. The house felt different now. It wasn't the same place they had moved into just days before. It was as if something was watching them, waiting. Later that night, after the family had gone to bed, the house was still. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Emma lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The events of the evening, Rex's strange behavior, the noise outside, had her on edge. She turned to John, who was already asleep beside her, his breathing deep and even. A sudden thud broke the stillness, followed by another, this time louder. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she sat up in bed, straining to hear. Rex's barking had stopped, but the thuds continued. They were coming from upstairs. She waited, frozen in place, until the sound came again. It was unmistakable, the heavy thud of something or someone moving around upstairs. "John," she whispered urgently, shaking him awake. "John, do you hear that?" John groggily sat up, his eyes wide with confusion. "What is it?" "There's something upstairs," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. John's eyes darted toward the ceiling. He was listening too now. The thuds came again, followed by a scraping sound, like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. "I'll go check," John said, his voice steady despite the knot tightening in his stomach. He grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand and stood up, moving quietly toward the door. Emma stayed in bed, her breath shallow, her mind racing. The noise was unmistakable. Someone or something was upstairs. John opened the bedroom door, peering into the dark hallway. Rex was nowhere to be seen. "Rex?" John called quietly, but there was no answer. The thuds came again, this time closer, right above them. John stepped into the hallway, holding the flashlight in front of him. His footsteps were muffled against the carpet, and the house seemed eerily still. The noise stopped. Everything was quiet for a moment. "Maybe it's just the house settling," John muttered, trying to reassure himself. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. He slowly moved toward the stairs, the light from his flashlight flickering against the walls. The The steps creaked under his feet as he ascended, each step heavier than the last. He reached the landing, and the thud started again, much louder now. It was coming from the boy's room. John hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. "Luke? Eli?" he called, his voice tight with worry. There was no answer. With a deep breath, he opened the door. The room was empty. Everything was still, except for Rex. The dog stood in the corner, staring at the wall, his body stiff, his ears alert. His low growl echoed through the room, sending chills down John's spine. And then, out of the corner of his eye, John saw it. A shadow. Just a glimpse, but it was enough. The shadow darted across the room, disappearing into the hallway. John's heart skipped a beat. John stood frozen in the doorway of the boy's room, his eyes searching the darkness. Rex growled low and steady, his fur standing on end as he stared into the corner of the room. The shadow that John had seen, the one that darted across the room, had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. But the air felt different now, charged with an unnatural tension that was impossible to ignore. "Rex," John whispered, his voice hoarse. "What is it, boy?" The dog didn't respond, his focus unwavering. Rex's teeth were bared now, and his tail was stiff with unease. John stepped cautiously into the room, scanning the space with the flashlight. The room was still, the only sound the soft click of the dog's claws against the floor as Rex shifted his stance. John's mind raced. He couldn't explain what he had seen, what had moved across the room. There was nothing visible now, nothing out of the ordinary, but the feeling of something lurking just beyond the reach of the light was palpable. He turned toward the bed. Luke and Eli's room was small, but the beds were empty. The covers rumpled as if the boys had tossed and turned in their sleep. The window was slightly open, the curtains billowing in the cool night air. He moved toward the window, his heart pounding in his chest. Maybe it was just his imagination, maybe the house settling, but there was no mistaking the eerie chill that had taken hold of the room. He reached out and pulled the curtain aside. The yard outside was bathed in moonlight, and the trees were swaying gently in the breeze. Nothing moved. John let out a slow breath, trying to calm himself. It was just the house, he told himself. It was old, creaky. It played tricks on the mind, especially at night. But then he heard it. A soft, scuffling sound from the hallway, followed by the faintest creak of the stairs. John turned to Rex, who was still growling, his focus fixed on the door. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation. Something was out there, something that wasn't supposed to be. Without thinking, John rushed toward the door, opening it just enough to peer into the hallway. The house was silent again, the oppressive quiet that had settled over everything making his skin crawl. Rex's growls had stopped, but his body remained tense, and his eyes never left the hallway. John stepped into the hall, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He could feel the presence, that nagging sense of being watched, but he saw nothing. The air was colder now, and every creak of the floorboards beneath his feet made his heart skip a beat. As he made his way toward the stairs, the sound of heavy breathing filled the air. A low, raspy exhale like someone, or something, was hiding just out of view. "Luke? Eli?" John called, trying to keep his voice steady, though his throat was dry with fear. There was no response. He moved slowly down the stairs, his flashlight beam flickering. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, pulling away from the light like they were alive. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he felt it, an almost tangible presence behind him. He spun around quickly, but nothing was there. "Emma!" he called out, his voice rising in panic. "Emma, get up!" There was no answer from the living room, no sound except the distant thud of his own heartbeat in his ears. Rex had fallen silent, his eyes wide, his tail tucked between his legs as he stared at the front door. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of scratching came from behind the door, sharp, clawed, and deliberate. John froze. It wasn't the wind. Rex barked frantically, his fur bristling. The scratching continued, growing louder and more frantic, as though something was trying to get in. John rushed to the door, grabbing the handle, his hands slick with sweat. "Emma!" he shouted again. "Get the boys! Get them out of here!" Emma appeared in the doorway of the living room, her face pale with fear. "John, what's going on? What is that sound?" "I don't know, but it's not good," John said, his voice low and filled with dread. He opened the door, shining his flashlight into the yard. The yard was empty. The moon hung high in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass. But something was wrong. The air felt thick and stagnant, and there was a sense of unease hanging over everything. The scratching had stopped, but Rex was still barking, his fur standing on end. "John, what are we going to do?" Emma asked, her voice trembling as she clutched the doorframe. "We need to get out of here," John said firmly, his mind racing. "Now." Before Emma could respond, the sound of rustling from the woods behind the house made both of them turn. It was too quiet, too deliberate, and it wasn't the wind. Something was out there. John's heart raced. He quickly grabbed Emma's arm, pulling her inside. "Stay close. Stay quiet," he ordered. "We're leaving. We need to get the boys and get out of here now." Emma nodded, her face a mix of fear and confusion. She turned to run upstairs, but before she could take a step, the scratching noise started again, louder now, echoing through the house. It was coming from the walls. John's breath caught in his throat. Something was inside the house. Something that had been there all along. The walls seemed to pulse with the scratching sound, like something was clawing from the inside, desperate to get out. John's heart was pounding in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears as he stood in the living room, frozen in place. "John, what's happening?" Emma whispered, her voice barely a breath. She was at the bottom of the stairs, her hand gripping the railing tightly. Rex was still by the door, growling low and menacingly, his eyes fixed on the empty darkness outside. The scratching stopped for a moment, and for a brief second, the house felt eerily silent. But the peace was short-lived. A loud bang came from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving across the floor. "Luke! Eli!" John shouted, his voice breaking the silence. "Stay in your room. Lock the door and don't come out." Emma looked at him, wide-eyed, as she hurried to the stairs. "What's going on, John? What is it?" "I don't know," John said, swallowing hard. "But we need to move fast." They needed to get out, now. John could feel it in his bones, the oppressive, suffocating sense that something was lurking, waiting, just beyond their sight. He turned toward the door again, and Rex's barking grew more frantic, more desperate. "It's like he's trying to warn us," Emma whispered. John didn't need another reminder. His instincts were screaming at him to get his family out of the house. But the thought of what was in those walls, what had been lurking in the dark, was enough to freeze him in place for a moment longer. Then, the window shattered. The glass splintered, falling to the floor in a rain of shards. John whipped his flashlight toward the sound and saw the shadow move, fast, almost too fast for the human eye to follow. Rex bolted toward the front door, barking furiously, and for a moment, John thought he might have gone mad, thinking he could stop whatever was out there. But the dog wasn't done. He ran in circles in the yard, staring into the trees as though the very earth itself were alive and watching them. "John," Emma cried. "What is happening? What's out there?" John opened the door quickly, just enough to peer outside. He saw nothing, but the air was thick with something unseen, something that made his skin crawl. The darkness in the trees felt like it was closing in. "We need to leave," John repeated, his voice firm now, despite the dread bubbling in his chest. "Now." Emma nodded, her face pale with fear. She ran up the stairs to the boys' room, her footsteps quick and urgent. "Luke! Eli!" she called. "We're leaving. Get your things." John was right behind her, taking the stairs two at a time, but the moment he reached the top, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The boys' room door was wide open. The room was empty. "Luke? Eli?" John called out, his voice shaking. No answer. He rushed inside, scanning every corner of the room. There was no sign of either of them. The scratching had resumed, louder now. It was almost rhythmic, as if something was dragging itself through the walls, moving closer to them. "Where are they?" Her voice cracking as she grabbed John's arm. "I don't know. I don't know," John stammered. Panic surged through him. He pushed past Emma and moved down the hall, calling their names. "Luke! Eli!" When he reached the next room, his eyes landed on something that stopped him cold. The window was wide open, and outside, standing in the yard, was a figure. It was tall, too tall for any human. Its shape was vaguely human, but distorted, wrong. It was as if something was trying to be human, but it wasn't quite able to pull it off. The shadow moved, its long limbs shifting with unnatural speed, its head turning toward the house, locking eyes with John. The figure didn't approach. It just stood there, watching. John's breath caught in his throat. He knew, deep down, that whatever was out there wasn't just any creature. It was something far worse. The kind of thing that belonged to the nightmares, not the real world. Emma grabbed his arm. "John, what do we do?" John didn't answer. His mind was racing. The shadow outside had to be connected to the strange happenings in the house. The scratching, the movements in the walls, it was all connected to this thing. And Luke and Eli, where were they? John backed away from the window, his eyes never leaving the figure. It stayed there, motionless, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "We need to find them," John said finally, his voice low and determined. "Now." John's heart pounded in his chest as he pulled Emma closer to him. The shadow outside was still, unmoving, as if it were waiting for them to make the next move. The air felt thick with tension, and the scratching sound from the walls had intensified once again, now echoing throughout the entire house. It was as if the house itself were alive, groaning under the weight of something far darker than any of them could comprehend. "Where are they, John?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with fear. "Where are Luke and Eli?" John gritted his teeth. He had no answers, no explanations, only a gnawing feeling deep in his gut telling him that time was running out. "We need to get out of here," John said urgently. "We can't stay here another minute." He motioned toward the stairs, his hand gripping Emma's wrist tightly as they descended quickly. The house felt oppressive now, as though the very walls were pressing in on them. The air was colder, and every step seemed to echo louder than the last. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, Rex's frantic barking filled the air once again, but this time it was different. The dog was barking toward the back door. John hesitated, looking toward the door. The shadow in the yard had disappeared. But that didn't mean they were safe. No, not yet. John had a horrible feeling that something was out there, waiting for them to make a move. "Stay close," John ordered. He grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her toward the kitchen. "We need to find Luke and Eli. Now." The kitchen was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the window. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet as they moved quickly, but the stillness of the house made it feel like they were walking in slow motion. Every sound felt amplified. John motioned toward the back door. "We have to check the yard." Emma hesitated, fear flashing across her face. "John, no, we can't." "We have no choice," John interrupted, his voice hard. "We need to find them. I'm not leaving here without them." They moved toward the door. Rex, still growling, was pacing back and forth, his eyes darting toward the yard and then back to the door. John opened the door slowly, the cold night air rushing in with a gust of wind. He stepped outside cautiously, scanning the yard, but it was empty. The moonlight cast long shadows across the ground, but nothing moved. "Luke, Eli," John called out, his voice filled with desperation. There was no answer. John's breath came faster as he moved farther into the yard. His eyes scanned the trees, the dark, looming shapes that seemed to reach out toward him. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard a faint rustling, but it was too far away to make out any details. Then, a sharp yelp broke through the silence. John turned quickly, his heart leaping into his throat. "Rex!" he shouted, but the dog was already running toward the edge of the yard. Without thinking, John sprinted after him, Emma close behind. The sound of Rex barking grew louder, and as John reached the edge of the trees, he saw the dog stop suddenly. Rex was staring intently at something in the woods, his body rigid and tense. John's breath caught in his throat as he followed Rex's gaze. There, standing between the trees, was a figure. It was tall, its form outlined by the dim light of the moon, but it was not human. It was far too tall, too thin. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, and its skin, if it could even be called skin, was pale and ashen. The figure's face was hidden in the shadows, but John could see its eyes. They glowed faintly, an eerie, unnatural light. "John?" Emma whispered from behind him, her voice shaking. "What is that?" "I don't know," John replied, his voice barely a whisper. "But we need to get back to the house, now." Without warning, the figure moved. It didn't walk, it glided, shifting through the trees with terrifying speed. John's mind barely registered the movement before the creature was gone, fast swallowed up by the darkness. But before John could react, a faint cry echoed from the woods. Luke's voice. "Dad! Eli, help!" John's blood ran cold. Without a second thought, he turned and ran toward the sound, pushing himself harder, faster. Emma called his name, but he couldn't stop. His legs burned as he sprinted deeper into the woods, Rex right behind him, barking furiously. The woods were dense, the trees thick and tangled, but John's focus was razor sharp. The voice had come from somewhere nearby. He knew it. He had to find his sons. Luke! Eli! John shouted, his voice hoarse as panic set in. The cry came again, louder this time. Dad! John's heart nearly stopped. That was Luke. He was close. John pushed through the underbrush, his flashlight darting across the trees. And then he saw them. Luke and Eli, huddled together at the base of a tree, their faces pale and terrified. Rex bounded toward them, his tail wagging frantically. Dad! Help! Luke cried as John rushed to his sons. John knelt beside them, his heart pounding. What happened? Are you okay? What did you see? Eli's eyes were wide with terror. It was out there. Before Eli could finish, a low growl filled the air. Rex's hackles were raised, and the dog was staring toward the trees with a deep, guttural growl. John stood up slowly, his mind racing. He knew what that growl meant. It was coming for them. The growl from the trees grew louder, more menacing. John's breath quickened as he grabbed Luke and Eli by the shoulders, pulling them close. Rex was still growling, his body low to the ground, his eyes locked onto the darkness that seemed to close in on them from every side. We need to get out of here, John hissed, trying to keep his voice steady despite the terror rising inside him. He looked around, but the woods were thick with shadows, and the only light came from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the canopy above. Luke grabbed his father's arm, his eyes wide with fear. What is it, Dad? What's out there? John didn't have an answer. He didn't know what it was. He only knew that it wasn't something human, and it wasn't something that would stop until it got what it wanted. Stay close, John said, his voice grim. We're getting back to the house now. He turned quickly, guiding his sons through the trees, his mind racing. He could feel the presence behind them, following them, but he dared not look back. He had to keep moving. As they reached the edge of the trees, John saw the silhouette of the house in the distance. His legs burned from the sprint, but he pushed on, urging his sons to move faster. Come on, just a little further, he muttered, his voice tight with panic. The growl was closer now, the sound vibrating in the air, like the earth itself was shaking in fear. Rex was still at the rear, barking furiously, his body tense as if every fiber of him was aware of the danger approaching. They were almost there, so close, when suddenly there was a loud snap, like a branch breaking under a heavy weight. John's heart stopped. Something was in the woods, something much larger than he had imagined. Then, without warning, the creature emerged from the trees. It was faster than anything John had ever seen, its long, twisted limbs carrying it through the underbrush with unnatural speed. The creature's body was covered in a patchy, mottled fur, but its face was the worst part. The eyes glowed with a feral intensity, and its mouth was filled with jagged, razor-sharp teeth. It stood upright, but its movements were erratic, like a twisted parody of a human. John's stomach dropped. This was no animal. This was something else entirely. And it was coming for them. Run! John shouted, pushing Luke and Eli ahead of him. Rex was already ahead of them, his barking frantic as he ran toward the house. John looked over his shoulder just in time to see the creature launch itself forward, its claws outstretched toward them. It was faster than anything should be, too fast to outrun. John's mind screamed at him to move, but his legs were frozen, his body paralyzed with fear. Suddenly there was a roar, a deafening, guttural sound, and the creature stopped in its tracks. John didn't hesitate. He grabbed Luke and Eli by the shoulders and yanked them toward the house. They ran, all three of them stumbling, nearly tripping in their haste. But the creature was still too close. He could feel its presence, smell its rancid, earthy stench in the air. As they neared the house, John's heart pounded with the thought that they might not make it. The back door was open, a sliver of light spilling out into the darkness. But the creature was still coming, its growl growing louder and louder. Then Rex turned around. The dog was growling, his teeth bared as he faced the creature. John's heart sank as he realized what Rex was doing. The dog was trying to protect them. "No, Rex!" John shouted, but it was too late. In a flash, the creature lunged at Rex, its claws slashing through the air. The dog yelped in pain, but it wasn't enough to stop the creature. The beast's claws dug into Rex's side, and with one swift motion, it knocked him to the ground. "Rex!" Eli screamed, his voice breaking with terror. John reached the back door and threw it open, pushing his sons inside. "Get inside now!" John shouted, his voice hoarse. He shoved Luke and Eli into the house, but he hesitated. He had to go back for Rex. He couldn't leave him out there. But just as he was about to turn, the door slammed shut behind him. Emma stood in the doorway, her face pale and wide-eyed. "John, no!" she cried, but it was too late. The door was already locked. John stood there, breathing heavily, his heart racing. He had seen it, seen the creature tear into Rex. The thought of his dog, his loyal friend, out there alone, hurt and vulnerable, made his stomach twist. "Dad," Luke said quietly, his voice shaking. "What was that thing?" John looked at his sons, and for the first time, he didn't have an answer. He couldn't explain what they had seen. What was happening? All he knew was that they were in danger. And no matter how fast they ran, no matter how far they went, they would never be safe. The house seemed colder now, the shadows stretching longer, as if the darkness had entered with them. "We have to leave," John said finally, his voice breaking the silence. "Tomorrow, we're getting out of here. We'll figure out what to do then." But deep down, John knew. No matter where they went, they could never escape what was out there. The house was eerily quiet now, but the silence was far from comforting. John sat on the couch, his head in his hands, his mind racing. He couldn't stop replaying the image of Rex being dragged away by that creature, the way the dog's body went limp as it was tossed aside like a rag doll. Emma stood by the window, peering into the dark yard, her face pale with worry. She didn't speak, but John knew she was thinking the same thing. Could they really leave tomorrow? Could they really just walk away from whatever had attached itself to this place? "Mom, where's Rex?" Luke asked, his voice trembling. He was standing near the door, his eyes wide and fearful. Emma turned to him, her face softening, but the look in her eyes was one of helplessness. "I don't know, sweetie," she whispered, "but we'll find him tomorrow, okay? We just need to stick together tonight." Eli was sitting next to her, his head resting against her arm. The 10-year-old looked as if he was about to break down any second. "What was that thing, Mom?" he asked in a whisper, barely audible. Emma swallowed hard, trying to keep the fear from her voice. "I don't know, Eli, but we're going to be okay. We're together, and that's what matters." John stood up suddenly, pacing the room, unable to sit still. The windows were locked, the doors too, but it felt like the walls were closing in on them. The pressure of knowing something, someone was out there, watching them, was nearly unbearable. "I'm going to check on the perimeter," John said, his voice low and grim. "John, please," Emma pleaded, her hand reaching out. "Don't go out there. It's too dangerous." John looked at her, his expression softening, but only for a moment. He couldn't explain it to her. It wasn't just the creature outside that scared him. It was the helplessness. He had to do something, anything, to protect them. "I'll be quick," he said, his voice firm, but he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "I just need to make sure we're secure." With a final, lingering look at his family, John grabbed the flashlight from the table and moved toward the door. The cold air hit him immediately as he stepped outside, the stillness of the night making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The yard was empty, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. John took slow, careful steps, his flashlight sweeping across the yard. He could feel the creature's presence lingering in the air, its gaze fixed somewhere in the dark. Every corner, every shadow seemed to hide a threat. As he moved toward the edge of the property, he froze. In the distance, he saw something. A figure just beyond the tree line, standing motionless in the dark. The glow from its eyes reflected the light from his flashlight, and for a moment, John couldn't move. The creature was back. John's pulse quickened as he stepped back, trying to make as little noise as possible. His heart hammered in his chest as the figure slowly moved toward him. He couldn't see it clearly, but he could feel its malice, like the air itself was charged with dread. Without thinking, John turned and sprinted back to the house. His breath came in ragged gasps as he reached the door and slammed it shut behind him. He locked it quickly, but he knew it wouldn't hold forever. Inside, Emma was standing by the window, her eyes wide with fear. Luke and Eli were both huddled together on the couch, looking terrified. "What happened?" Emma asked, her voice shaky. John didn't answer right away. He was too out of breath, too rattled. He looked toward the front door, knowing that whatever it was out there, it was still watching, waiting. "We're not safe here," John said finally, his voice low and tense. "That thing, whatever it is, it's close. We need to leave. Now." Emma's face went pale. "Leave in the middle of the night?" John nodded grimly. "We don't have a choice. We're not staying here another minute. We have to go back to our old state. We have to get away from here." Eli, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "But what about Rex?" His voice cracked with emotion. "What if we can't find him?" John's heart ached at the question, but he pushed the pain aside. They couldn't afford to stay. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. "We'll find Rex, Eli," John said, trying to sound reassuring. "We'll get him back, but right now, we have to get out of here." John moved toward the stairs. "Grab whatever you can, whatever's important. We're leaving in 5 minutes." Emma nodded, though her expression was filled with hesitation. She didn't want to believe what John was saying, but she could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear she felt in her own heart. Luke was the first to move, grabbing his backpack and shoving his things inside. Eli followed his lead, and even Emma started to gather her things, though she moved slowly, as if in disbelief. John looked out the window one last time, his eyes scanning the yard for any movement. The creature was gone, but John knew it wasn't finished with them. The front door creaked open, and John's heart skipped a beat. They had only seconds to get to the car. John's heart pounded as he glanced over his shoulder. The car was just outside, but the night was still thick with an eerie silence. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the creature was somewhere out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the whole world was holding its breath. "John, we need to hurry," Emma said, her voice tight with anxiety. She was already by the door, Luke and Eli right behind her, but her eyes were darting nervously around the room. "I know," John replied, his voice strained. He grabbed his jacket from the coat hook by the door and threw it on, trying to steady his nerves. They couldn't afford to hesitate. They couldn't afford to stay another minute. "Where's Rex?" Eli asked quietly, his voice trembling with worry. John hesitated. He didn't want to say it. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew they needed to face the truth. They couldn't leave without Rex, but they couldn't wait any longer. If the creature was as close as he thought, every second counted. "We'll find him, Eli," John said, his voice firm. "We'll come back for him, I promise." Eli didn't say anything, but his face fell. Luke placed a hand on his younger brother's shoulder, trying to comfort him. "Let's go," John said, his voice breaking the tense silence. "Stay close to me." They moved quickly, stepping outside into the cold night air. The gravel of the driveway crunched under their feet as they walked toward the car. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness, making John's nerves itch. As they reached the car, John quickly unlocked the doors and ushered his family inside. Luke and Eli climbed into the back seat, their faces pale with fear. Emma sat beside John in the front, her eyes scanning the surrounding darkness. "Drive, John. Drive fast," Emma urged, her hands gripping the seat as if she could feel the danger closing in. John started the engine with a low growl, and they pulled out of the driveway, their headlights cutting through the night. The gravel road leading away from the house seemed endless, winding through the woods as if trying to trap them in its grip. John kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white from gripping the wheel too tightly. He didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. He didn't want to see if the creature was following them. They drove for what felt like hours, the silence inside the car only broken by the hum of the engine and the occasional nervous breath. Luke and Eli were both staring out the windows, their eyes wide with fear, but neither of them said a word. "Dad, what was that thing?" Luke finally whispered. John glanced at Emma. She was staring straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap. "I don't know," John replied, his voice low. "But I think it was a werewolf." Luke's eyes widened. "A werewolf?" He looked over at Eli, who was staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. "I don't know what it is, Luke," John said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But I do know one thing. We need to get as far away from here as possible." Emma sighed, her breath catching in her throat. "We can't just leave Rex behind, John. We can't." John's heart clenched. He knew Emma was right. They couldn't just leave their dog, their loyal companion, out there. But what if it was too late? What if the creature had already taken him? He could only imagine what Rex had gone through. I know, Emma, John said, his voice filled with guilt. But right now, our priority is getting out of here. We can't risk staying in that house any longer. Emma nodded, though her face remained tight with worry. She glanced back at Luke and Eli, then looked out the window again, packed as if hoping to spot Rex out there somewhere in the dark. But all they saw was the dense forest, stretching on for miles. As they drove, John couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. It wasn't just paranoia. Every so often, he would hear something, footsteps, a rustle in the trees, and his heart would race. He would glance in the rearview mirror, but all he ever saw was the empty stretch of road behind them. It wasn't until they had driven a good distance away from the house that John began to relax. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly, but the gnawing worry in his gut remained. They were far enough away now. Surely they were safe. But even then, the thought of Rex lingered. It was an ache he couldn't shake. "Do you think Rex is still out there?" Eli asked quietly from the back seat. John didn't look back at him. Instead, he kept his eyes on the road, his grip tightening on the wheel again. He wasn't sure what to say. He didn't want to give Eli false hope, but he couldn't bear to tell him the truth. "I don't know, Eli," he said, his voice hoarse. "But we'll come back for him. I swear we will." The end of part 1.